Hi, Josh.
Hi, Bob. Always good to be back.
Always good to have you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of Nonzero newsletter, which, by the way, latest issue of that has a piece that's very relevant to what Josh and I are going to talk about today. You, Josh, are a professor at the University of Oklahoma. You teach about the Middle East. You're also director of the Center for Middle East Studies there, and you are one of the foremost experts in America, I would say, in the Middle East, and also, one of the most kind of candid and straightforward commentators on the Middle East, I would say. And so it's always a pleasure to have you on, although often world circumstances are not pleasurable to behold when I'm having you on, because you tend to show up when things are falling apart. That's not a coincidence. That's when I ask you to come on. Now, let me explain that we're going to talk about something that's very fluid, which is to say the conflict between Israel and Iran. There's a possibility that there will be important developments between the time we record and the time we post. So I'm going to tell you where we are now, and then we're going to talk about things that will remain relevant and illuminating regardless of what's happened. And then later in the conversation, we'll get into some things that may be overtaken by events, and we may say things that will look stupid only 24 hours later. Who knows? Maybe peace will break out in the Middle East, and the whole premise of this will seem ridiculous. So, as I think most people know at this point, which is Monday morning, Iran is widely respected to retaliate for an assassination that Israel conducted on Iranian soil last Wednesday. It also killed a Hezbollah commander in Lebanon. That's kind of part of the mix in ways we can get into, but I think the central issue for Iran is that this assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, was done on Iranian soil. And, he doesn't spend that much time in Iran. So this was like, there were other ways to kill him if you wanted to. They might have had downsides from Israel's point of view, but in any event, Iran seems to be taking this very seriously. So why don't we start out by just setting the background? And I don't know where you want to start, Josh. We could talk about who Ismail Haniyeh was, what his place was in the constellation of kind of Hamas actors, and then get into why you think Israel decided to assassinate him here and now.
Okay, let's start with, now, Haniyeh is the political leader. He was deeply engaged in the negotiation. He lives in Qatar, which has been playing an instrumental role in negotiating between all sides, Hamas, the US, Europe, and of course, Iran. And this was key to the talks that are being carried out between the United States and Hamas. He is not the decider on the battlefield. That's Sinwar, who is still alive, we believe, in the trenches someplace under Gaza. But he's clearly important. And we've been hearing from the United States and from President Biden and Blinken that negotiations are moving forward nicely and we're getting close to a ceasefire and so forth. This clearly put paid. In some ways, Israel accomplished two things in killing Haniyeh. Three things, I should say. One, it took a step further on its promise of total victory to kill all of the Hamas leaders and as many of their soldiers as possible, to eliminate Hamas. So symbolically, this was important for them on that level. Secondly, it stops the ceasefire negotiations and gives, in a sense, I think, Netanyahu more time and pushes further his agenda. Thirdly, it sends a message to Iran, which is, we can get you any place. Our intelligence is very good. You're weak, and we can hit you right at home. And we don't know how the assassination was taking place. The Israelis seem to suggest that it was a bomb planted in the house But the Iranians are denying that. They're saying it was a missile that was sent in, which would, of course, be much less bad news to them because it would mean that Israel had not penetrated their intelligence. But we've been reading articles that that Iran has arrested many of the people surrounding this house where he was staying. So we don't know how he was killed yet at this point. But it was very embarrassing for Iran. And many people saying that Iran has to strike back swiftly. The Iranians have said that they will. And even though it may not make good sense for them to do that.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned three motivations. Some people are attributing a fourth motivation to Israel. This is kind of a standard thing that comes from some corners when Israel escalates, which is they want a war with Iran and they want the U.S. involved on their side in a war with Iran. Well, I mean, I would say at a minimum that thought must not appall them because they know that's like one possible outcome.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Look, this does Netanyahu a number of services, and one major service that began with his speech in Congress is to shift the focus from Gaza to Iran. That is key in his strategy. Netanyahu has been pounding away saying this is not about Palestinians. This is about Iran. We have to take down Iran. United States, let's go shoulder to shoulder in taking down this evil Islamic state. And then the Middle East will be at peace. The Houthis, the Hezbollah, Syria, all of them will be, in a sense, liberated from this octopus's grasp.
But what do you think the then looks like from Israel's point of view? Like, you win the war with Iran in what sense? And you probably do win if you've got the U.S. on your side. Then again, I mean, Iran, I suppose Russia's not really in a position to provide a lot of help for Iran. So let's stipulate we in some sense win, but what does that look like? I mean, do you have to, do you occupy Iran? What, presumably a big goal is to wipe out all, advanced nuclear processing facilities and make sure that sticks. What does that look like from Israel's point of view, the ideal outcome of a war with Iran?
Well, I think what Israel, if we take the logic of this, Israel was badly hurt when October 7th was carried out successfully, or at least as successfully as it was carried out. It made Israel look weak. It made it look vulnerable. It had gone to sleep at the wheel, but it also made Hamas and the Palestinians look potent. The Abraham Accords collapsed overnight. I have a little anecdote which I've used once before on the show, which was that I was invited to speak to the Defense College of Oman, of all places, just a few days after this. And all the questions by the officers, about 70 or 80 officers who were listening to this lecture, were Israel's weak, America's weak, the Islamic world and so forth is on the march.
And they were saying that as a result of October 7th?
They were saying that as though they were convinced, these officers were quite excited about this notion that the balance of power was changing in the Middle East. And I think that one of the things top of Netanyahu and his government's mind has been to really smash any of those hopes, right? That you have to put paid to any sense that Israel is on borrowed time, that there's a Salah ad-Din out there that could come and hurt Israel. And of course, there's a secondary agenda, which is to keep the international community from getting behind the notion of an independent Palestinian state. Because immediately after October 7th, President Biden, when he first had to say something, said that we cannot return to the status quo. We have to move towards a two-state solution. Now, that is anathema to Netanyahu and his government. So they have to shut down that discourse, get total victory, put the Palestinians back in a box. And of course, the Palestinians aren't alone. So they need to discipline Hezbollah. They would like to defang Hezbollah, at least for the next 20 years, as they did in 2006 in the fighting, and also shut Iran up. Now, I think Israel was very gratified in their April attack when they killed a bunch of Iranian generals in Damascus, in the embassy. Iran
in the Iranian, an Iranian
embassy in Damascus.
What Iran considered its own territory, in effect, within Syria, and that's why Iran responded. Well, that's one reason Iran responded.
Right. It was a clear escalation on the part of Israel, and Iran felt it had to regain deterrence. So it sent 300 missiles and various drones and so forth towards Israel, all of which were shot down, or almost all of which, through this U.S. Gulf Israeli cooperation network, which worked very well. Now, Iran did telegraph it, and some people suggest it meant for its missiles not to get through, but it just to demonstrate that it would do this. Now, in a sense, we're facing a second moment that is a little bit like that, where Iran feels that its deterrent power has been badly hurt, and it needs to reestablish deterrence. Israel, of course, wants to go a step further than it went in April, which is, I believe, to show unequivocally that Israel can get the last word on this, and by mobilizing the United States. And that's where Netanyahu, I think, has a moment. If we look at his strategy, what does he have? Another year, 2 years? He could have more than that. But let's say he's
good at hanging on. And I want to eventually get around to this distinction between Israel's interest and his. We've been kind of talking about this from Israel's point of view, but then he's got his own political interests that may or may not coincide with Israel's interests, and may or may not coincide with even, the mainstream view of Israel's interests within Israel. But go ahead and finish what you were going to say.
The strategic, if you want, his lifelong mission is not to have a Palestinian state, to deny the Palestinians a state, to acquire all of historic Palestine or a Jewish state. And he has worked hand in glove with the settler movement, in a sense, pushing the settler movement forward and scuttling things like Camp David and the various agreements, finding ways to draw them out, pedal the bicycle and stationary, to keep it going without.
And this is a theme of his whole political career, basically. I mean, this is a true part of his ideology. He does not want to solve a two-state solution to this problem.
And he's maintained that, for over 20 years. And even when he was a young man in the United States, his earliest interviews suggest this is he does not believe that the Palestinians are ever going to accept an Israeli state, and he just doesn't want Palestinian state. So he believes this is Israel. So if you want to compete that, if he is thinking about his legacy and completing this legacy, not just, everybody says, oh, he's just got to keep his coalition together and he's in this struggle against time because he's trying to survive on the seat of power. There's that. I don't deny that, but I think there is a larger mission involved, which is that he has been working towards this for a lifetime. He wants to see it completed. Now, he could do these things, and he is the master of American politics in a way that no prime minister that comes after him will be able to do the same way, to come and address Congress in the way he does and get, how many, 50 standing ovations. I forget exactly how many it was, but it was a lot, more than most presidents get. And he has harnessed American support. Pro-Israeli groups in the United States are at a peak of power. Whether it's through money donations, whether it's through ideology, whether it's through Christian support, or just basic American notions that Israelis are like Americans. They're engaged in this struggle against barbarism. As he put it in Congress, as Netanyahu put it, it's civilization against barbarism.
And can I just inject another very fluid thing where we'll also be overtaken by events, but that's the question of who Kamala Harris's running mate is going to be. I mean, the point you just made may strike a little, some people as counterintuitive, because there's been all this talk since October 7th of, the new progressive part of the Democratic Party that's pro-Palestinian and is feeling its oats and exerting real power. And this is going to be a real test, I think. If she picks Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, who, by the way, when he was young, said what Netanyahu said when he was young that you just said. We now know that Josh Shapiro wrote in his college newspaper when he was 20 or something, look, the Palestinians just are never going to, we can't have a two-state solution because they'll never get their shit together. They're just, all they do is fight. And I think it'll be, and not to mention, I mean, he's been kind of, pretty adamantly pro-Israel in other ways, sponsoring legislation that would, punish universities that do certain things, by way of disinvestment and so on. So I think this is going to be a real test, but I think you are right that at the end of the day, the pro-Israel forces have shown a lot of power. I mean, even to get back to college campuses, they played a role in the firing of 2 Ivy League presidents, right? And
campuses across the land. I mean, I can testify that campuses across the land are terrified of this issue. They want to suppress any discussion of the Gaza issue, of the Zionism, of anti-Semitism. The whole thing frightens them because they have all of them have donors. All of them have politicians who are looking over their shoulders. It's a minefield. It's a third rail, and presidents of universities across the land are a little bit. They're shaking in their boots. They just want this to calm down and go away, and it's clearly not. Everybody was wiping their foreheads. Most university presidents last May, thinking, "God, thank God, it's the end of the year. Yeah. These demonstrations are just coming on." But Netanyahu, but Biden will have this resolved by the fall. And we're walking right into it. It's coming up, as you say, with the real question of Josh Shapiro versus somebody else, because Josh Shapiro makes tons of sense. Pennsylvania is the biggest electoral state of the swing states, and he would help Kamala Harris, who has made some vaguely pro-Palestinian pronunciations. She's not strong in foreign policy. It might help her with winning pro-Israeli support.
Could hurt her in Michigan, a swing state, conceivably, right?
That's
because of the Arab American population.
Are you going for the youth? Are you going for the youth vote and the people who might care about this? Is that vote big enough? Or is Biden right and others right who say, you've just got to do the bear hug and you've got to go with Israel all the way? And that's what Netanyahu, to come back to him, is counting on. He is convinced that he can make a end run around any president on this issue. He can go to Congress, he can win support, and he's seeing it. Why is Biden sending the Abraham Lincoln, aircraft carrier flotilla to Israel to help shoot down these Iranian, he has marshaled America onto his side. If there is a war, if there is escalation, and Israel is to go to war against Hezbollah, it would like to take out a lot of Hezbollah sites and put Lebanon, really destroy a lot of infrastructure in Lebanon. It would have to get the United States not only to provide the weapons to do that, but to pay for it, which will be billions of more dollars from Congress. And it looks like it would get that at this point. It would be a shoo-in. So if Netanyahu could get the United States to pay for it, shift the focus to Iran from the Palestinians, try to take the teeth, at least for the next 20 years, out of Hezbollah, so that they have to be rebuilt, this would certainly hurt the Islamic government in Iran at a time when it doesn't need this. It's a time when it's fighting to provide some economic goodies to its people. It's on a roll with Ukraine and Russia, because Russia is doing very well in the Ukraine fight. Its weaponry has been instrumental in that.
The drones mainly?
The drones mainly, and also missiles. It's providing factories and backup for.
Yeah, but it may need those missiles before long. It may wish it hadn't sent so many to Ukraine before long.
Well, you may be right. The point is that in a sense, the Ukraine war has been going the right direction for China, Russia, Iran. And they felt confident that they're digging their way out of these American sanctions haven't worked, that America doesn't have the real power, Ukraine is going to go down, and that this is a virtuous cycle for China and Iran in weakening the United States and its allies. Now, so in a sense, there's a lot at stake in this escalation.
And meanwhile, Iran has a newly elected, relatively moderate president. Now, the U.S. has exhibited a pattern of undermining relative moderates in Iran. I mean, when the Trump administration pulled out of the nuclear deal, for example, that discredited the moderates. This guy, had enough popular support to get elected president. The Supreme Leader did not want him to be elected president, I don't think, but he got elected president. He's got to be unhappy that Israel has put Iran in this position, right? He would rather, I assume he would like to do what he can to restore less acrimonious relations with the U.S. and the West broadly. But he's not happy, right?
Absolutely. His whole campaign was about reintegrating Iran into the international community, trying to dial down all of this rhetoric of conflict, and in the long run, trying to get sanctions lifted, because that's what Iranians want. Iranians want to get out from underneath the American sanctions, which have been slowing down the economy and impoverishing Iranians from one end of the country to the other. So obviously, this escalation hurts him, hurts moderates. It puts all the worst, militaristic elements back into the headlight on both sides of the equation.
Yeah. So let's get into what exactly Israel did and what the exact thinking was. Now, first of all, as I said, this assassination came on the heels of a separate but not unrelated thing, which was that, of course, Israel has had this slowly escalating conflict with Hezbollah along the Lebanese border since October 7th. But both sides, Hezbollah doesn't want an all-out war, I think, and I guess Israel doesn't. In any event, it's been calibrated carefully enough to keep it under control. So Israel, first what happens is that a missile lands in the Golan Heights at a soccer field or something and kills 12 Druze kids. Druze are Arabs, but not conventional Muslims. Long story. They're the only. I think they're the only kind of Arabs who serve in the Israeli military. Although I doubt people in the Golan Heights are as inclined to do that. I don't know, but
the Golan Heights Druze in Majd al-Shams, this town that was hit, it's important because their status, they have rejected Israeli citizenship. Israel annexed the Golan Heights after the 67, in the 70s.
Syrian territory originally. And
Syrian territory that it conquered in 1967. And the Druze have been offered citizenship in Israel. Some Druze have accepted it. Many Druze have rejected it. These Druze in Majd al-Shams had rejected Israeli citizenship. So it puts them in this delicate situation where they're on the side of resistance, in a sense. And here they're being killed putatively by this Hezbollah rocket. The Hezbollah denies that it said, why would we do this? This makes no sense. This was a rocket that was being shot down by Israeli Iron Dome, and that was what caused it to hit this field. It's Israeli,
I think they're claiming an Israeli missile, defense missile, actually fell down. But right. What strikes me about these things is when this happens, and they have this argument, Israel says it was your missile, and Hezbollah says it wasn't. The truth is, everyone knows Hezbollah didn't do this intentionally. Nobody in Washington or Israel thinks that Hezbollah did this intentionally, right? And yet, the conversation proceeds as if whoever did it, isn't that kind of strange? Like, how often did you see anyone note in the media or anywhere else that, look, this definitely wasn't an intentional act by Hezbollah, right? But
it gave an opportunity for Israel to escalate on this.
It's just weird.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, for Israel, it's clearly very important. For Netanyahu's total victory mission to be successful, he cannot allow Hezbollah to empty out 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers of towns that are close to the Lebanese border because it makes Israel look weak.
Which has happened, right? I mean, they have been evacuated.
They have been evacuated because in order to keep them safe from this tit for tat back and forth. And from Hezbollah's point of view and Iran's point of view and Hamas's point of view, the more pressure that can be brought to bear on Israel, the thinking would be that Israel would have to sign a truce more quickly and that it would get better terms for Hamas in that truce if there's pressure all the way around and it's going to cause America to intervene. That logic clearly has not held because Israel, it looked like it was holding because America didn't want it to escalate. It pushed for these talks and so forth, but America's failed. And Biden's policy has failed completely to bring about a ceasefire. And Netanyahu has been able to push forward with his total victory agenda, and he's sold it in Congress. And Biden is left wanting to win elections, get the pro-Israeli support and the money that is necessary for his campaign, not to have too many billionaire defectors go from him to Trump, which of course has happened with several billionaire defectors who say that Biden hasn't been strong enough on Israel, and therefore they've left and gone over to Trump. So you don't want that bleeding to go along. At any rate, the point is that Hezbollah has hurt Israel. And if you want a total victory, you don't want to have any kind of a balance of power that is causing a deterrent factor. And Hezbollah has been very good about deterring Israel. It did push Israel out of Lebanon after a long occupation, starting in 1982 invasion.
Well, that's what created Hezbollah, right? It arose as a resistance to Israeli occupation in Lebanon.
Absolutely. And of course, Iran was a factor. The 79 revolution in Iran allowed for an ally. Now, Israelis always say it was Iran that created Hezbollah. Hezbollah and other, pro-Palestinians say no. It was Israeli occupation that caused Hezbollah. And those are the two arguments. And of course, there's a little bit of correction in both sides, but Hezbollah would never have come together as it did without an Israeli occupation. The Shiites of Lebanon were the dirt farmers. They were unorganized. They were hardly a factor in the politics of Lebanon. But occupation organized them and turned them into a fighting machine, the likes of which the region has not seen, and they've become very potent. So, at any rate, the point of our discussion here is what will Netanyahu wants to defang Hezbollah. It's part of the total victory. There are many people pushing him forward. I mean, I received Daniel Pipes in the United States, who runs Middle East Forum. He has been pushing a total victory. He's just published a book on total victory, the victory agenda in Israel, that he has been pushing for decades, which is that you can't make peace with Palestinians. And it really goes back to revisionist Zionist thinking that was put forward by Vladimir Jabotinsky in the 1920s with his important document called the Iron Wall, in which he said, Palestinians are not going to give up their national aspirations. This was their land, just like Native Americans. You need to completely destroy their fighting spirit and demoralize them. And you have to do it many times because they're not going to give up. And that's guiding right-wing Israeli argumentation. And it has provided an ideological sort of now.
And October 7th made it more than a right-wing perspective in Israel, right? I mean, it almost radicalized. Not that there had been by that point. I mean, I think almost everyone in Israel had kind of given up officially or unofficially, but I mean, there wasn't a very active left in support of,
labor has collapsed. And if you look at all the polls in Israel, they have been going down steadily on two-state solution. There is
right.
a minority of Israelis, 25% of Israelis still believe in a two-state solution. It is extremely unpopular. None of the political alternates to Netanyahu, if there were going to be a new government formed, are in favor of a two-state solution. So at least nothing that looks like.
Leaving aside the question of whether the facts on the ground realistically permit such a thing at this point, given the density, the number of settlements and the interconnected roads and so on. So Israel assassinates this senior Hezbollah guy in or around Beirut on the hours before. Yes. Assassinating, and again, that's not the reason Iran's going to retaliate, basically, but it adds an important dimension to this because
it fires up Hezbollah.
Yeah, it means that, I mean, look, this is a recipe for a wide war. When you think about it, you kill this senior Hezbollah commander, so you got them feeling that they need to retaliate. On the same day, you kill the very head of Hamas. I mean, nominally, there was some tension and issues of who had the real power, and even of how much he knew about October 7th in advance, and maybe we can get into that, but because he was not in Gaza. But still, you're killing the leader of Hamas, so you're kind of putting them in a bad mood. Not that maybe they have a lot of options at this point, given their
Dave, you announced that Dave was killed in the attack on Khan Yunis, and so you've got three major leaders that have been killed in a very short period of time. Right. It's clearly a provocation. It's in Israel,
and by killing one, what I want to say, on Iranian soil, you're bringing Iran proper into it. This is just a recipe. And this is by way of asking you, I mean, don't forget whatever you're going to say, but I do want to ask you, what do you think exactly Israel was thinking? They surely knew this was a significantly escalatory act.
Yes. Israel wants escalation. Netanyahu wants escalation. That's very clear. He wants escalation. He has gotten America on his side. His speech in Congress was extraordinarily good, and it showed that America is lined up and ready to support him. Now the aircraft carrier division, the aircraft carrier.
Is it Lincoln and
Abraham Lincoln has moved into the Mediterranean to support with its missiles and so forth, its radar intelligence abilities to support the kind of missile counterattack and to help shoot those down. Mm-hmm. Now, but everybody is mobilized to side with Israel in the United States, in Washington. So that's good. Netanyahu's got his ducks in a row. He's ready for a counterpunch. In fact, I would suspect he's eager for a counterpunch. He will never have this kind of opportunity again. The Israeli army is completely mobilized. The Israeli public is terrified and sees this as an existential crisis. And the United States is mobilized at an election time when Israeli and pro-Israeli power is at its peak in the United States. Now, having said that, let me just give you the counter argument for why Iran, Hezbollah might just give this a pass in terms of escalation. I mean, if you think about it, what are their goals? Their goals are to weaken Israel, empower the Palestinians, and to promote their own national interests and their power in the region. And this war with Gaza has been very good for Iran. It has made resistance, the resistance axis as it's called, much more popular throughout the Middle East. Iran had previously been seen as a sectarian power that was helping Shiites in places like Iraq, Yemen, and Syria, and had turned Sunni world largely against it. And Saudi Arabia had been successful, and Israel had been successful in turning the Sunni world into an Israeli ally against Iran. That has completely collapsed, that equation, in the Middle East and public opinion. Today, the Sunni Arabs are clapping for Iran. They're against Israel. They look at the Gulf leaders as weak and as equivocating and as American puppets, and even Israeli puppets. The publics in Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, right across the land, are deeply invested in, and aggrieved by seeing Palestinians, so many killed, the universities blown up, the children running from one end of Gaza to the next, crying and saying, "Where's my mother?" That sort of thing, and which is on Al Jazeera every single night. They are lamenting this. So Iran has moved forward. What Israel is trying to do is shift international attention away from Gaza towards Iran. And here we come back to Napoleon's famous statement, which is, when your enemy, never interrupt your enemy when they're hurting themselves. And in a sense, Israel is hurting themselves in this fight with Gaza.
I was just going to say, this is why I try to distinguish between Bibi's political interests, and maybe his political interests and ideological obsessions on the one hand, and Israel's interests. When you say that the entire Arab world is now turning against and hardening against Israel, and people may think, well, haven't Arabs always hated Israel? Well, actually, things were moving in Israel's direction in the Arab world, and the grassroots response you're talking about makes it hard for Arab leaders who would like continued rapprochement with Israel to pursue it. I mean, I would think this is just bad long-term for Israel's interests. And am I wrong? I mean, and Bibi, of course, didn't have to sustain the war in Gaza this long. And that's what it seems to me is making things worse and worse and worse for Israel. He could have, I don't know what he could have done politically, but in a game theoretical world, Israel could have stopped its response after 6 weeks or something, right? And it just seems to me this has not been good for Israel. And I guess maybe they think, well, no, but now we can do this jujitsu and conquer Iran. I don't know. What are you going to do in this war with Iran? That's going to be enduringly good.
You would bomb the nuclear facilities.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's really just humiliating Iran and taking out some of their military infrastructure, but demonstrating that Iran doesn't have a counterpunch, a real counterpunch. That's right. The important thing here is to humiliate the leadership in front of their people, turn the people against the leadership, and to weaken your enemies in a way. Netanyahu continues to talk about mowing the lawn. He just used the phrase in a speech the other day. And that is the end game that he's looking for.
By which we should say people mean you never really solve the problem of violent resistance, for example, in the Palestinian territory. You just go in every once and kill a bunch of people and, militants, and then it's under control for a while, and then you'll do it again. That's what mowing the lawn means, right?
Yes, you're reestablishing your credibility, your prestige, and you're degrading your enemy's ability to counterattack. And of course, you're advancing your agenda because the settlement movement moves forward. The United States accepts it. The international community accepts the Palestinians are losers and that they're not going to get a state. Now, the problem with this is that there are 7 million Palestinians living within historic Palestine, the boundaries. There are 7 million Jews. The Palestinians aren't going away. The original idea and the hope.
They may leave Gaza before the end of this, and I think especially if Trump is elected president, but we can get into that later. I don't rule out a wholesale ethnic cleansing of Gaza at this point, but...
Well, that was clearly a hope in the beginning that Egypt would somehow become would receive these Palestinians fleeing from Gaza. It hasn't happened. The entire world has said it should not happen. They've accepted this, that the Palestinians are going to remain there. And that that's the big, it doesn't look like Israel is going to be able to ethnically cleanse, that this has not been the opportunity, unless there's a big escalation. And that's where it would play.
That's where we are right now, right?
Where we are. That's where we are. And a big escalation would open up the doors for all kinds of strange things to happen, which could be this kind of big movement. But, that's why the United States, I think, and the international community are so determined not to have this happen. And I think they're talking to Iran, they're talking to Hezbollah, and they're saying, don't get suckered into this. And in a way, they would be suckered in, which is one reason to think that they might just put it off and say, Israel is weakening itself. If we can hold the line without escalating, return the focus back to Gaza, because the end game, there is no end game. As you were saying earlier on, there is no end game for Israel today, because they're going to have to occupy. Israel's going to have to occupy these 2.23 million Palestinians in Gaza, not to mention, the close to 4 million Palestinians in the West Bank. And that occupation is not going to go away. The world is going to see it for the terrible inequalities that it has, the brutality of it. And the only way that the PLO and the Palestinian Authority could possibly return to Gaza is if there is some kind of coalition government between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. And
could Israel live with that if they killed Sinwar first?
That they do not want to live with that.
Even if Sinwar's dead.
This is, the point is that it's the defeat of everything Netanyahu has been working for.
Mm-hmm.
Netanyahu has been working from the beginning to separate Hamas from the PLO, to keep the Palestinians divided so there's no one voice, so you don't have to negotiate with one voice, and so that major and popular group like Hamas is a terrorist organization that the entire world sees as terrorist and cannot negotiate with, which gives Israel the perfect reason not to negotiate and to keep on mowing the lawn and to move forward with its settlement project.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if the West and the Palestinians can come together, as China is trying to do with its most recent, several weeks ago, China held a conference between 12 different Palestinian factions, and they all came together and announced a unified front. Now, they didn't reconcile in any really meaningful way, but Barghouti and others said the main point of this National Unity Front is to deny Netanyahu the ability to say there are no Palestinians to talk to,
mm-hmm.
and to present the international community with a fait accompli saying, we have to take charge of Gaza when the fighting stops. And that is exactly what Netanyahu does not want to have happen, because it would be a defeat, his total defeat of the total victory, which is that Hamas is going to be history.
Mm-hmm.
And if Hamas is allowed to create some kind of a unity government, and the PLO and the PA and the other groups are saying Hamas has to be part. Hamas is a popular group. They have fought this war. If we don't go step by step with them in some kind of national unity government, there's going to be no legitimacy to any government in Gaza, and which is really what Israel is looking for.
Well, is there any actual plausible way the Gaza war ends in a way that's acceptable to Netanyahu? Plausible.
Well, it would end with some kind of occupation where Israel is able to find collaborators who will do the work.
Okay.
And it leaves...
good luck with that. Good luck with that. I mean, you now have you're going to have every young male in Gaza pretty much is related to someone who's been either killed or maimed by Israel. So if you think it's going to be an uneventful occupation, I've got some really bad news for you. I mean, this is just crazy.
You're right. It's swallowing a porcupine. And that's what Israel is doing. And that's why I think that Hezbollah and Iran, in the end, will probably not go for the counterattack here and not allow themselves to be provoked. I mean, it's an argument. I don't know what they're going to do. Obviously, for national prestige reasons, there's a lot of pressure on Iran to provide some kind of deterrent response to Israel. But it will only play into Netanyahu's hands, I think, and move the picture from Gaza to Iran and mobilize America on Israel's side. And that's I don't think, Iran wants to keep Israel divided and focus on those divisions. And Israel is divided. The international community is divided. The international community is increasingly alienated from Israel. Young people are alienated. So in that sense, I think the lower profile Iran takes in this, the better it is for Iran's strategic interests.
Well, I want you to elaborate that, and I want to talk about what retaliatory options would be open to Iran, and if it chooses one, what that might be. But first, I want to say we've reached the end of the public part of the podcast. We usually with these have an overtime segment that's available to Nonzero newsletter members. You can become one of those by going to the Nonzero newsletter Substack. And Josh, you've been kind enough to say you'll stick around for the overtime conversation. And I want to say, I mean, one thing I'm going to ask, one thing I want to pursue is, you said the U.S. is talking to Hezbollah and Iran, trying to, it's kind of ironic because in theory, the actor we have leverage with is Israel, right? We're giving them the weapons. And also, like, how likely is it, if all we're doing is trying to rationally persuade Iran, how likely is it we're going to tell them something that hasn't already occurred to them? These people aren't stupid. So I want to get into all that. But first, I want to give you a chance to tell people where they can find your stuff. You're very active on Twitter at, is it Joshua Landis, your handle, or what is your handle?
It's Joshua _Landis.
Landis with an I, Landis.
Yes, Landis with an I. And I also write for Responsible Statescraft. I just published a short article, co-authored a short article there on why U.S. attitudes towards Syria, or U.S. policy towards Syria, if not their attitudes, should change as a result of the Gaza war, Turkey's new attempt to normalize with Syria, and of course, Syria being brought into the Arab League and other attempts to normalize with it. The United States is now a real outlier in its policy, which can't succeed.
Okay. And Responsible Statecraft is put out by the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. That's the whole name of it, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And do you have an affiliation at Quincy?
I do. I am a non-resident fellow.
Okay.
Quincy Institute.
And you'll be non-resident until Quincy opens up an Oklahoma franchise.
That is it.
Any moment now. We're waiting for some Oklahoma donor to show up. There is in Oklahoma something of a kind of a restrainer, military restraint constituency, I would think, right?
It's actually quite big. The military restraint, oddly enough, there are two poles, but we saw there was a real insurgency against Tom Cole's. Tom Cole is our congressman from Oklahoma, who is the head of the what's the most important committee that doles out all the money?
The Foreign Relations, Senate Foreign Relations, in the House Armed Services?
Yes. And the money bills go through it. And there were Oklahomans who tried to run against him saying, he's signed on to the Ukraine bill, to the Israel bill. He's just throwing our money at all these wars, these forever wars. And so the Republicans are facing some resistance to that traditional Republican foreign policy of supporting more and more military spending abroad.
Well, I was born in a military hospital in Oklahoma, so I support military spending on health services and hospitals and things. So thanks everybody who's stayed with us this far. Again, if you want to become a paid subscriber to the Nonzero newsletter, which is shockingly cheap, go to the Nonzero at Substack, and we will now head into overtime.